My next guest is a confrontational author, Rhodes Scholar, and political activist. Since the 1990 publication of Naomi Wolf's seminal book, The Beauty Myth, she's been shaking up establishment ideals of everything from pregnancy to fascism with an honest candor that most academics just can't seem to muster. And while some criticize her work as too personal, it's that exact lack of filter that has inspired an entire generation to challenge the status quo. So join me now to discuss everything from the state of politics to the role of women in a changing society, Naomi Wolf herself. Thank you so much for coming on, Naomi, a huge fan.
Thank you so much. That's one of the nicest introductions I've ever had.
That's awesome. So let's start by talking about yesterday's midterm elections. A lot of progressive issues from marijuana legalization to the minimum wage increases were approved even in deeply red states, yet the GOP took over the Senate. How do you explain the disparity?
That is a really good question. I think that what we're seeing is this kind of fragmentation of where people think they can make a difference. I think that there is a lot of activism, the internet has been part of this, at the state and local level. Here in New York State, we've seen grassroots campaigns really setting the agenda on a lot of issues because people can have an impact. You know, just a handful of registered voters in a certain constituency can really shift the playing field if they organize. But I think people feel incredibly detached from the federal level for reasons your audience is very familiar with. You know, after Citizens United, the rise of, you know, the vast sums, $1 billion in the last, presidential cycle for advertising, the role of money, they don't feel that it really matters and that the representatives really speak to them. So in a climate like that, going against Obama, is it's a playing card. It's a message that can resonate at a federal level when people really feel like everything they really care about, from housing to education to, domestic policy to no more war. We just went to war again without Congress, unconstitutionally, yet another war. No one even consulted the American people. So that's my read of this bifurcated scene.
Right,
yeah, people have given up on a national level.
I couldn't agree more there. And you, amazingly, you worked as a consultant to Bill Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign, Al Gore in 2000. How did you go from working that closely within the establishment to publishing a wake-up call about impending fascism in America just 7 years later?
Right. Well, just for the record, I worked informally with the Clinton campaign. I was advising their advisor, and then I worked formally for the Gore campaign for Gore 2000, working on messaging and policies for women. How did I go? Well, I mean, it was partly being inside the belly of the beast that led me to understand maybe more clearly or early, what was happening in terms of the book I wrote, which I think you're referring to, The End of America, which argued that there's a systematic assault that began with Bush, but has now carried on and escalated with Obama against our liberties in the United States. I guess when you're inside the belly of the beast, you see how fragile democracy is and how convenient it is for stakeholders and gatekeepers and electeds and incumbents and the people who are funding them, which is 6 major industries right now in the United States, funding both parties, how convenient it would be for them to just get rid of democracy altogether. They don't want to hear from constituents. They don't want constituents to be organized and empowered. They don't really want democracy to work. And so, because it's really inconvenient to have to win elections rather than just sitting with the 6 people who fund you and dividing up the pie. And if you're Halliburton or you're, Big Pharma or you're Big War, you don't want the people to have a voice. You just want to sit with your representative and say, okay, start another war because, we need to keep growing that 45%, that the war industry is up in 2014 in America. So I guess I saw also not only how much these powerful entities want to get rid of democracy, I studied closing societies around the world, and I saw that all closing societies or fascist societies or totalitarian societies do exactly the same things to either close down democracy or keep democracy closed and suppress the chance that it would resurface.
In the book, The End of America, you outline those 10 steps that a government takes in order to subvert democracy. I mean, at this point with Obama's presidency nearing an end, what steps have and have not yet been employed? Because when you wrote that book, a lot had already been on its way.
Yeah. I'm sad to say, I say this with no pride, that everything I predicted in that book has more than come true. And it's not that I'm so prescient, it's that once you know how to close an open society, you can predict what's going to happen. So everything, all the 10 steps are being actualized, and they're much further along than I could have even imagined in 2008. I mean, we basically have martial law now. Because we have the National Defense Authorization Act in 2012, which gives the president the power to seize anyone, anywhere, at his will or her will, and hold them indefinitely without charge or trial. We have a surveillance state, which was step number 4, I believe. And actually, we're seeing what's really scary to me, and you have a global audience, this is important, is that we're seeing exactly the same legislation introduced in democracy after democracy to close down people's remaining liberties. We're seeing surveillance bills in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and Britain. We're seeing, new curbs on the free press in, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Britain. We're seeing the sort of meme of the terrorist. You can do anything to the terrorist, and then dissent becomes like if you're a protester, you're a terrorist. You're seeing that in democracies around the world. So this is definitely a blueprint that's now global. We now have a kill list. I mean, it's incredible that I even can say this sentence. The president draws up a list of Americans to assassinate. Al-Awlaki was an American citizen. He took out Al-Awlaki without charge or trial, and he took out his 16-year-old son without charge or trial. So this is 1984. I mean, it's here, it's happening, and so the issue is to wake people up, and I think people are a lot more alert, to realizing that there basically kind of has been a coup. It's just more visible in certain places, and there's still, what people don't understand is you can have police state, essentially, and that's what I mean when I say a coup. Many aspects of America are now a police state, and other things seem to continue as normal. And so people kind of don't recognize that, oh my God, it's a police state, because it doesn't look like, grainy newsreels of 1933 in Germany. People are still shopping, they still vote. It's not like a blanket thing. But look at Ferguson in, the way the militarization of the police forces, which is the definition of a police state, is that instead of domestic police who are answerable to mayors who are elected by the people, you have this Department of Homeland Security sending for profit vast, tanks and
grenade launchers to schools. I mean, it's
snipers, and it's like, this is what happens in a war zone or a police state. This is not the United States of America. So it is here. And so our strategy now has to be how to fight back.
Right, and even mainstream publications like the Boston Globe, I mean, they're basically documenting the existence of a shadow government here, Naomi. They're saying that the NSA,
really?
The intelligence community, the surveillance state, operates just self-governing. It does not matter what voters do, who they pick. These agencies will be self-governing until we actually do something drastic, I guess. I mean, it's just amazing to see them kind of outlining that. And I think you're right. I think it's this guise of a democracy where there's this global blueprint all around the world, and people still think that we are free. And I guess that's the best slavery. That's the best tyranny, is when you think that you're free. I wanted to go on to, of course, you've come under a lot of heat for simply questioning things, but I wanted to talk about one of them in particular. One of the steps in the book, of course, is that internal surveillance, which you just outlined, confirmed to Americans through documents leaked by whistleblower Edward Snowden. You were highly critical of the veracity of Snowden's story. I wanted you to go over what you found problematic and if you still felt that way today.
Yeah, I think that I'm more open to the possibility that he's a genuine whistleblower. But as with so many of these stories, my frustration is, and I was, the center of some controversy a couple of weeks ago for simply saying, document it, investigate it. I mean, what's worrying to me is that we need the free press to ask questions, the kinds of questions they used to ask, independently verifying what the State Department says, what the White House says. And by and large, the press in America has stopped doing that. So there hasn't been much independent, investigation of the Snowden story. There hasn't been much independent investigation or confirmation of, the ISIS stories. A lot of stories that go to hyping people's fears or escalating our sense that we're always under threat, which is very lucrative for, the war industry. There tends to be less and less independent verification. So what I do see is that the surveillance rollout is global, and that's why I worried that he was, actually I said, this guy's trained as a spy before it was even known that he actually had been a spy. We knew he was a contractor, we didn't know he had actually been a spy. and you could tell that from the way he presented information. So I'm open to the possibility that he's an authentic whistleblower because of sources who are in that world who have said that that's more likely than I thought. But my worry remains the same, which is that there's a rollout which seems coordinated and everyone's on the same page using the same sound bites in all of these democracies around the world, basically establishing that we're in a permanent 360-degree surveillance reality.
What about Brazil? You know, of course, Rousseff is now building that internet to avoid NSA surveillance, right, to Portugal
so
there.
cool.
And then, of course, James Clapper, I mean, perjured himself on the court when he said the NSA does not collect data on millions of Americans, which is a felony. Why would he do that if he was involved kind of in this backhanded rollout?
Why would he perjure himself? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, I think the truth is there is impunity now. It doesn't really matter if you lie to the American people anymore, which used to be an offense punishable by at least losing your position, if not prosecution. It doesn't really matter if you lie to the American people. I mean, I witnessed a spokesperson for the NSA speak to a room full of 400 journalists at an event The Guardian held and basically intimidate them and threaten them and say, we'll go after journalists who do national security reporting, we'll prosecute you. I mean, it was chilling and frightening, and also lie to them about the nature of the surveillance that they'd been doing. You see lies all the time, which is a hallmark of a closing society, when in a democracy there is such thing as truth, because you have a free press that can verify and separate truth from lies. And in a closed society, citizens really don't know what's true anymore. Why would Clapper lie? I mean, I don't know the exact circumstances that you're describing, but I think that the messaging we're getting from the NSA is that basically the NSA is in charge and the Pentagon is in charge, and it really doesn't matter that much who's sitting in the White House. And in this respect, people really have to understand a police state doesn't happen like the Pentagon takes over or the military takes over and you don't have any civil society figureheads. In fake democracies around the world and police states around the world, the military is effectively in charge, and the secret police, which is basically the NSA, the surveillance apparatus, is basically in charge. But you still have a president and a Supreme Court and a press. I mean, I was just in Singapore, and they have elections and they have media, but everything's controlled by the government. So people really have to understand what's scary is that the power is draining from the window dressing. What's scary is that it really doesn't matter that much at this point who sits in the White House or who wins the election at a federal level if we don't get our rights back and put teeth back into driving these agencies back into the marginal support positions that they're supposed to hold in a real democracy.
Right, and yeah, I mean, as I was mentioning before, the Dilma Rousseff thing, it seems like there's this huge rift globally where, as you said, kind of the Western powers are going lockstep along with the same type of legislation. Then you have all of Latin America, South America kind of standing up to the surveillance state. It's a really interesting rift, and I don't know where that's going to go, but it definitely seems like they're not on board. Let's move on to your project called Daily Clout. You're talking about what we can do. I mean, Boston Globe's already admitting that we live in this kind of, self-governing surveillance state, shadow government. What can we do locally? Because I feel like people are very disenfranchised. Obviously, the elections
totally
just prove that. Naomi, we have about a minute left. Talk about your project and any advice that you have.
So it's very exciting because it is a what can we do. It's a democracy-building community and web startup with technology that lets you embed search results for legislation right in a blog or news article and then send it flying through social media. And we're also doing citizen journalism on Facebook. Come look at it, us. You can go to Naomi Wolf on Facebook, where the goal is to train everyone in the world to be a journalist so that there's no such thing as fog of war, so that people are accountable to what they're doing to the people. And we're breaking news stories continually. For instance, we had 500 people send in blank back ballots with, name, time, place. In the Scottish referendum, there was a lot of problems, to say the least, with the Scottish referendum. And so that's leading to investigations, judicial review, and news media coverage. It's fantastic. So those are the institutions we need to put the grassroots back in power, if not in charge.
Check it out, dailyclout.com, Daily Clout on Facebook. Thanks so much, Naomi Wolf, best-selling author. Amazing to have you on.
In the last presidential cycle for advertising, the role of money, they don't feel that it really matters and that their representatives really speak to them. So in a climate like that, going against Obama, is it's a playing card. It's a message that can resonate at a federal level when people really feel like everything they really care about, from housing to education to, domestic policy to no more war. We just went to war again without Congress, unconstitutionally, yet another war. No one even consulted the American people. So.
My next guest is a confrontational author, Rhodes Scholar, and political activist. Since the 1990 publication of Naomi Wolf's seminal book, The Beauty Myth, she's been shaking up establishment ideals of everything from pregnancy to fascism with an honest candor that most academics just can't seem to muster. And while some criticize her work as too personal, it's that exact lack of filter that has inspired an entire generation to challenge the status quo. So join me now to discuss everything from the state of politics.
That's my read of this bifurcated scene.
Right,
yeah, people have given up on a national level.
I couldn't agree more there. And you, amazingly, you worked as a consultant to Bill Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign, Al Gore in 2000. How did you go from working that closely within the establishment to publishing a wake-up call about impending fascism in America just 7 years later?
Right. Well, just for the record, I worked informally with the Clinton campaign. I was advising their advisor, and then I worked formally for the Gore. I think that there is a lot of activism. The internet has been part of this at the state and local level. Here in New York State, we've seen grassroots campaigns really setting the agenda on a lot of issues, because people can have an impact. Just a handful of registered voters in a certain constituency can really shift the playing field if they organize. But I think people feel incredibly detached from the federal level for reasons your audience is very familiar with. After Citizens United, the rise of, the vast sums, $1 billion.
To the role of women in a changing society, Naomi Wolf herself. Thank you so much for coming on, Naomi, a huge fan.
Thank you so much. That's one of the nicest introductions I've ever had.
That's awesome. So let's start by talking about yesterday's midterm elections. A lot of progressive issues, from marijuana legalization to the minimum wage increases, were approved even in deeply red states, yet the GOP took over the Senate. How do you explain the disparity?
That is a really good question. I think that what we're seeing is this kind of fragmentation of where people think they can make a difference.